Okay. That should be ready for you now. Okay. Were you able to connect the screen? Oh, you were? Okay. So I will switch it back to that. Computer will go to the screen reading HDMI. Yes.
Well, good evening. That's loud. Good to see everybody tonight. This is our fourth, as many of you know, the fourth of our 5 honors evenings. Tonight, we have 3 presentations. Chloe Sneed will be presenting first. She's a senior in education. She'll be looking at the impact of lockdowns on learning, especially elementary school learning. Claire Arden is a senior in communication. She'll be presenting on storytelling on cultural connections. And lastly, Caroline Branham, a second-year nursing student who's going to be presenting on the limitations of antibiotics when it comes to pediatric care. So our 3 C's, I tried to joke with them that we are sailing on the high seas tonight. Nobody told me that was a good joke, and that's because it's not a good joke. So But we're glad that you're here tonight. We have only one honors evening left, and that is on the night of December the 6th, when we have just one presentation. We'll meet in McCarty Auditorium. Tonight, to make sure that we can all get to the chorus concert the best we can, we're going to try to limit our presentations to a half an hour each. So Chloe's presentation will be followed by a question and answer from the panel, and then from the audience as much as you like, and we will move things along so that hopefully we can all hear truly good high Cs a little bit later. You wondered how I get to it, and that's how I got to it. So, Chloe, let me pull this up for you, and you will be all set to go. Right ahead.
Hi, thank you all so much for coming out tonight. I know this is a pretty busy Tuesday night at this point in the semester, but I know we all have worked hard on these presentations, and we're happy that you all are able to be here and maybe ask us some things that will help us learn even more. But so, as Dr. C said, for my presentation this year, I am choosing to focus on online learning and lockdowns and the effects and implications on education, specifically in elementary schools, but also for students of all ages. So, as we all know, almost 3 years ago now, our country began to experience something that would alter life as we knew it, and has proven to do so. In March of 2020, our country entered a state of lockdown after the World Health Organization declared coronavirus to be a global pandemic. Schools, churches, and workplaces were closed, with a major shift to remote learning and work. According to the National Center for Educational Statistics, 77% of public schools reported moving their classes to an online distance learning format. Social activities and extracurriculars came to a sudden halt. And so I approached this research with one question in mind. Did this shift to online learning have an effect on students? That was what I wanted to focus on at first, because we can't really study the effects if there were none. So after I researched studies and statistics, observed public school students, and discussed this topic with teachers, parents, and students, all findings supported the same conclusion, that online learning has indeed had an effect on students. And the more I studied the impact of distance learning, the clearer it became to me that what we have observed so far is only the beginning. The effects of COVID-19 on learning have yet to be fully seen. The vast majority of research on the effects of online learning focuses on the negative impacts of these circumstances. A study that I read did mention the positive effects that could result from e-learning, including autonomy, increased parent involvement, and less distractions. And while these are important possibilities to consider, many other studies delve into the negative effects of COVID lockdowns that are already being seen. While this may be because we as people tend to focus on the negative a little bit more than the positives that may come from something, it is important to consider all of these effects. The research and investigations have been conducted from many countries and states and provinces all across the world, including Indonesia, China, Japan, Canada, and many more. So it's evident that our students in America are not the only ones who are struggling with e-learning and the effects of COVID lockdowns. From reading these studies, observing classrooms, and talking to teachers and parents, I've gathered that currently the major effects we are seeing are not necessarily academic in nature, but rather emotional, social, and mental. While these things will likely also affect students academically if they are long-lasting, as of right now, those are the main impacts. Social emotional effects on elementary school students are yet to be fully seen. They have been seen to have a rise in temper tantrums, in anxiety, and poor ability to manage emotions during and after lockdown. And these are observations that have been made by teachers, parents, and others alike. School is one of the main avenues for children to learn how to interact and communicate with others. Positive interaction and problem solving are often modeled for students in what is a natural setting for them to see. Students learn through daily interaction, through lessons on working with others, through guided group work, and more. When online learning was implemented, these aspects of education largely disappeared. Students were at home for long amounts of time, with their only social interaction being their immediate family, And considering that a lot of parents and siblings were also working online at that time, interaction was really at a minimum for most people. So a study that I read involving adolescents reported that they expressed concern that their online learning environments provided few to no opportunities for social connections. And even though this is considered a great need amongst these students. So the following is a graphic from the study that I'm mentioning, and it shows what these same students, these are all adolescents who it was reported with parent consent, of course, and 62.5 of them reported negative emotions and outcomes from distance learning and COVID lockdowns, with only 27% feeling positive about it. There is 10% felt neutral, which I'm sure some of you are probably on board with that, but 62.5% shows a whopping margin of negativity in feelings towards distance learning. So the social emotional needs of elementary school students are crucial to development and to their future interaction with others. The decrease in these opportunities and interactions has clearly already affected students and likely will continue to do so. Students' mental health and well-being has also been affected by online learning and lockdowns. A Canadian study that I read, focusing on students' perceptions of mattering, reports that students who attended in-person school reported feeling that they matter much more than the students who were involved in online learning felt that they mattered. Since the beginning of the pandemic, the medically advised amount of screen time for children has not increased, which, according to the American Academy of Pediatrics, is no more than 1 to 2 hours per day for older children, and they recommend 0 hours of screen time for children 2 and under. However, the amount of time that elementary school students spend using technology and screens has drastically increased. This has taken a toll on students' mental health and well-being, which has been voiced by parents and teachers alike. Another factor that has affected students is the lack of physical presence of a teacher. There are many different formats of VLEs, or virtual learning environments. Some may include only pre-recorded videos or audios, whereas others may focus more on student-teacher and student-peer interaction. I'm sure we all remember, those of us who were in college or high school at the time, the different formats that our classes may have taken. I know for my classes, I had several teachers who chose to use pre-recorded videos. Then I had a few teachers who had us use Zoom or Microsoft Teams to have a more in-class feeling. And I can clearly remember the difference that it had on my learning in those classes. This can also affect students' mental health, as the format of VLEs has been shown to impact student learning and psychological well-being. Implementing one standard form of VLE would be difficult and improbable, if not impossible. However, this information is beneficial for school systems and administration to keep in mind when they are determining how their school will go about online learning. The physical presence of a teacher, even if it's just on the other side of a screen in a Zoom classroom that's live, makes a huge difference in student learning. One of the main ways that I've been able to learn about the effects of online learning is through observing classrooms and speaking with teachers and parents through my field experience and observation here while in the education department. I was able to observe an e-learning class for elementary school students in the spring of 2021, which is when schools were experiencing COVID shutdowns to a great extent. So I would drive to a school, and then I would walk in and sit in this little, basically closet that had been converted into a temporary classroom with the teacher while she opened up her laptop and had Zoom meetings with 24th grade students. So it was a little bit of a different learning experience for me, and didn't get to observe the students as much because all you can really see are their faces. And these were students who were required to have their camera turned on to show that they were there and to show that they were present. But still very different. You can't always see what students are doing with their hands, what may be going on this side of the screen, or anything else in the room. And so that teacher spoke to me a lot about the students' abilities and the quality of their work since learning had moved online. She disclosed that a lot of her more advanced students were learning to get by with doing the bare minimum, kind of cheating the system. They were figuring out ways to have to do less work and to succeed to the same extent by putting in less effort. She said that others were struggling to keep up with the classwork on their own, and these were students who often lacked parent involvement and support in their learning. And right now, I am teaching in a kindergarten class in a public school here in Tampa 2 days a week. And these are children who have not necessarily suffered academically from the lockdown as they were 2 or 3 years old when all of this began. But they definitely had a possibility of being affected socially and emotionally by these things. We have seen a good deal of separation anxiety in these students as they were at home for a great amount of time during their early years. And while this is to be expected with young students in general, we're now seeing it at a much increased rate from what it was before the lockdowns. Some of the students also struggle a lot with problem solving and independence. A term that we talk about a lot in education is learned helplessness. And that is when a child learns to rely on other people and approaches everything with the attitude of, I need help, I can't do this, help me with this. And a lot of times you'll see that in older students, but it's interesting to see that in students of this age who have not had a lot of experience and normally come in wanting to try things and wanting to learn, but a lot of, can you help me with this? Can you do this for me? From 5-year-olds, which is not always to be expected when what they're expected to be doing is something like writing the alphabet or their name. But as this age group moves through their schooling, it will be interesting to see if they are able to bounce back from all of these struggles or if this is something that will stay with them. So I have behind me a list of just some of the negative effects that I saw in the studies that I read in the classroom from talking to parents and other sources. So you can see rise in temper tantrums, higher levels of anxiety of all types, a decreased ability to manage emotions, a loss of independence, fewer opportunities for social connection and interaction, increased time spent using screens, a lack of a physical teacher presence, and feelings of disappointment, low motivation, and stress. So online learning and COVID-19 have clearly affected our young students. Their lives changed drastically when lockdowns went into effect, and we are already beginning to see the impact these things have had on students of all ages, socially, emotionally, and mentally. It's clear that these students will have challenges and difficulties to overcome. The question that stands in my mind is, how will we, as teachers, parents, friends, and citizens, ensure that the students of our country have all the tools and support they need to succeed in spite of the obstacles they will face? Thank you for your kind attention as I presented my findings. And now, any questions? I guess we'll start with the panel.
So the first thing I thought of, just from my own experience, is the effect that this had on like homeschooled kids, because those are kids that are used to doing things from their home anyway. Mm-hmm. Did you see anything in your research about the way that those kids handled the COVID lockdown versus, because obviously these public school kids are now missing all these social interactions that they would normally have, but homeschool kids had already kind of adapted to that. So did you see anything about that when you were researching?
None of the studies that I looked at really focused on homeschooling children. I don't know if that would be kind of a difficult thing to focus on since there are so many different formats of homeschooling, whereas public school is more mainstreamed. Because, you know, you have people doing co-ops, you have people doing online school, you have people whose parents are the main teachers. So I'm not sure if that would be something that will kind of be seen later in academic results more than right now in like psychological results that we see more in public schools or not. But I haven't really seen anything yet on that, which this information is also new, that research is definitely still coming out about it daily.
I was wondering, I think it's on, did you see anything about the effect of for teachers? 'Cause I know that was a big transition, but then you aren't dealing with necessarily, you know, the temper tantrums in your classroom where you're managing a whole classroom. So did you see like mental health effects on that end?
Definitely. I think most of us, if not all of us, are pretty familiar with the teacher shortage that is going on right now, and a lot of that is largely due to teachers quitting during lockdowns. A lot of teachers were not prepared for the online shift to learning, because if you think about it, teachers who have been teaching in the classroom for years and years, or even teachers who have just come out of college, nobody has learned how to present information to 26-year-olds through a computer screen. It's entirely different from anything that you've prepared for, anything that you've experienced. And so that has had drastic effects on teachers' well-being, teachers' mental health, teacher efficacy. There were several studies that I saw that mentioned the effects on teachers and how negatively they have also been affected on mental health. And some of them went into also how the teacher's mental health and self-efficacy also is going to affect the students in the class. And so those were really interesting. But as I was looking through them, I was like, this would be a whole other presentation if I talked about this. So I chose to focus on students. But there definitely is also a lot of information out there about what has affected teachers and how it will continue to likely.
You talked about how there were advanced students that had little tricks to cheat the system, but I was just wondering if there are any studies done on how much the children are actually absorbing and how their scores, maybe some sort of standardized testing, how that compares to before COVID.
I think it's too early for them to really set a trend because really the only results that we would have is about 1 year of testing. So I know that overall most states have had a decline in scores, but I think without multiple years of that being tested, it's hard to say like this is because of COVID. This is what we're seeing in the students who went through lockdowns. So I don't know that they can conclude necessarily that that's what it's from. I would lean towards that definitely, but I think in years to come, we will definitely see some research and studies and statistics about that, but as of now, it's still kind of ambiguous.
I was curious how a lot of these studies that you referenced measured the students' emotional well-being. Obviously, like academic standards are easier to measure, but emotional well-being is a lot more subjective.
Yeah. So schools have processes of diagnosing students with learning disorders and sometimes with emotional disorders or disturbances as well. And so there have been rises in those numbers. And then also like the study that I mentioned that I showed the chart from was a study that specifically talked to students about that, to minors with parental consent, and asked them about their feelings and how would you describe your experience and your attitude and your feelings toward online learning and towards the lockdown. So a lot of it has been some of it has been directly from students, some of it is teacher observed, and then some of it is just numbers and things like that.
You mentioned talking to parents and teachers and the negative effects that they brought. I was wondering if there was any congruency between like what the parents mostly saw in their own children and what the teachers saw. Like, was it the same or was it different?
I think it would be hard. I don't want to overgeneralize because this is just from the people that I've talked to, which is a pretty narrow pool because a lot of the parents come from the same background or have the same interests, and then the teachers are mostly teachers down here in the Tampa Bay area. But what most of them have mentioned that I've seen is a lack of motivation from students, and so it's harder to motivate students to want to learn and to succeed in learning when you're not physically there with them and when they don't have like that constant encouragement and push and hey, get back on track, like, oh, are you with us? Like, everybody needs to be on this part, which you can do to some extent through a screen, but it's not the same as in a classroom. And so I think parents and teachers alike have mentioned that in a lot of different ways, and then also just stress and anxiety when it comes to school and social interactions is something that I've heard a lot as well.
What really caught my attention was when you mentioned the separation anxiety. Mm-hmm. I know a lot of people got pets during the pandemic, and we really saw how those pets, from being with the owner all the time, once the owner returned back to work in the office or whatever the job was, those pets were having a really tough time. So I can only imagine like the effect with kids and how they can like really show that in the classroom.
Yes. Yeah, we've definitely seen that a lot, especially with this young age, because I think when you think about a 2 or 3-year-old, they're not going to have a concept of much before lockdowns if they were 2 years old when the lockdown started. And so now a lot of them also didn't go to preschool or VPK because of COVID still, because schools were still dealing with all of that last year. And so a lot of parents chose to keep their children home. And so we're seeing kids who have really probably never been away from their parents for more than a couple hours at most. And now we're bringing them to school for 7 hours, 5 days a week, which is a huge adjustment. And so it makes sense that they would have a lot of separation anxiety when really all that they know is being with their parent pretty much all day, every day. So, yeah, it is interesting for sure to see the effect on them.
Chloe, do you find anything with the relationship that a teacher normally would build with a classroom? How much that was factor in this? There is no relationship that you can build effectively.
Yeah, it was, especially talking to the teacher who I observed with who was teaching online, she talked a lot about how she had a hard time getting through to students because a lot of it was filtered through the parent instead of through personal one-on-one interaction with teacher and student. And so she talked about how a lot of the parents would tell their kids one thing about the teacher or about the class or about the work, and that can really have an impact on their view. And then also just motivation, I think, is a big part in that too, because you see a lot when students and teachers have a relationship and have that bond with each other, like the student wants to succeed because they care about what the teacher thinks of them, and the teacher wants the students to succeed because they care about them as an individual as well. And so I think motivation is a big thing that has shown in that lack of relationship.
And to touch on what Claire's going to talk about, there is a bond, and there's something going on there with, you're thinking about things at the same time, common stories, and so I won't say anymore. Any questions from the audience? We have time for a few. Yes, ma'am.
I noticed there were like kids that I interacted with actually during the lockdown that they were in like kindergarten, first grade, which is obviously a critical time in education because they're learning fundamental like aspects of going to school, being a student, and then also just basic like reading and writing. So is there any like did you see a big emphasis on that age group that's now like in third grade or so with like attention deficit or is there any like a big focus on that group that was so young during the lockdown? Did you see any research on that?
I haven't seen any research on that age group specifically. I know that it's hard to tell with that age group because standardized testing typically starts around second or third grade. So the students who were in kindergarten and first grade when the lockdowns began, we have basically no academic data on them besides just classroom work and then some like diagnostic tests. But I'm sure it's presenting in students of all ages from what I've heard from other teachers and seen in research. So I'm sure they are being affected too.
Anything else? Yes.
I was just wondering, now to me, I think there would be a different effect, but did you see a different effect on groups of students that were of low SES versus middle versus high?
Yes, so there were several studies that I saw that really dove into that aspect as well, because when you think about students who maybe come from a low socioeconomic status, they're not going to have all of the resources that students of high socioeconomic status would have, like internet at home, computers and laptops at home, access to someone, maybe a stay-at-home parent who is there with them to help them with learning, even access to like online tutoring that I know a lot of kids used during COVID. So it definitely, a lot of people talked about, is online learning equitable? Where's the equity in online learning? And so that's definitely something that schools have to consider, is if their students have the ability to complete online learning, to an extent that is on them. Because when you think about the lack of those things, that's not the student's fault. And that shouldn't be something that they have to worry about in their schoolwork being graded or the expectations that are placed on them. And so I think teachers and schools just have to definitely keep that in mind. But we did see a lot of disadvantaged areas and schools that had to come up with more creative ways to do e-learning, which sometimes just looked like a paperwork of packet being sent home. So it just depends on the area and what the administration decided to do a lot.
Todd, did you have a question?
Yeah, so this kind of goes beyond, my question's kind of beyond the study of your study, but at least in my homeschool district, we saw a lot of problems of just like she was saying, signing in and then checking out, like just not being mentally there. What was like a potential solution? Because this is like, at least back home in Texas, like this was a widespread problem of standardized testing scores going down, kids weren't learning. Like what's the solution that these school districts are coming to, like different changes in the classroom?
I think that varies greatly district by district because it is a district decision. It's not something that's mandated usually by states or by federal government at this point. So you're going to see a lot of discrepancies in what schools are choosing to do. For example, a lot of schools gave students the option last year for the 2021-22 school year of either coming to in-person classes or doing an online learning format. And so you see some students are choosing to do the online learning format who maybe really should be getting that in-person instruction. And maybe some of the students who are coming to the in-person instruction would probably be fine with online learning because when that decision is left up to families, a lot of times the needs of the student are not going to be completely met. But I think it's just something that we're constantly having to adapt to and kind of adjust to the new normal of online learning, and districts and areas are having to decide what works best for their students and what's feasible in their area.
All right, we'll need to shut it down there so we keep to our schedule. But we appreciate you very much, Chloe. Thanks for your good work.
Thank you.
Claire Arden, again, senior in communication, has been interested in storytelling, the cultural connections that makes, and she's going to present to us next. So, Claire, we'll get you set up here.
Can y'all see my mouse? Because I cannot. Where did it go? There it is. All right. Thank you all for bearing with my technical errors. Tonight I'll be talking about storytelling with you all, and as Dr. Chris Bell said, this is something that I've been very interested in for a long time. I think most of you probably agree with me in saying that storytelling, stories in general, have been precious to most of us for most of our childhood. But I want to talk about storytelling tonight in the context of communication as a whole. When communicating information to others, whether you're developing a sales pitch, teaching a lesson, or outlining a treatment plan, one of the most important questions, and oftentimes one of the most difficult to answer, is how can you make people care? And even though you probably don't realize it yet, you already have an incredibly powerful tool at your disposal to tap into the memories, emotions, and behavior of your audience. You and I, as humans, are hardwired to communicate through storytelling. Before the alphabet and the internet, civilizations throughout time have explained the world and preserved their cultural values through stories. Even today, we are just as much shaped by the stories we tell as they are shaped and told by us. But today I want to ask the question, why are stories so powerful? What in the way that God created us makes storytelling such a compelling form of communication?
So this evening, I'd like to explore with you all how the brain responds to storytelling and what allows stories to uniquely engage, connect with, and influence their hearers. So, stories first engage our brains. There are few things as fundamental to human communication as storytelling. In many senses, it is our default means of communication. As much as 65% of the time we spend communicating with others in informal conversation is devoted to telling stories, both about ourselves and about others. At first glance, it is easy to see that we like stories because they don't take much effort to process and remember. But why is that? At least one aspect of stories' engaging nature is that they stimulate our brains in ways that other kinds of communication simply do not. Scholars have known for a while that the language regions in the brain, like Broca's area and Wernicke's area, play a role in interpreting written and spoken words. But a succession of new studies have revealed that stories have the ability to activate several other areas of the brain as well. For example, researchers in Spain found that reading words with a strong sensory association, like coffee or cinnamon, stimulated their participants' primary olfactory cortex. A 2012 study from Emory University found that reading metaphors involving texture, like velvety voice or leathery hands, activated the sensory cortex. Similarly, a study by the Laboratory of Language Dynamics in France discovered that words describing motion cause activity in the motor cortex in areas related to the movements described. Here's what's going on when that happens. Sensory stimulation is a catalyst that converts external information into personal memories. Good stories put your whole brain to work, which exponentially improves the chances that story-coded information will be remembered. Think about it like this. As you move through life, your brain constantly processes your circumstances and makes predictions about the future. Storytelling works because it jump-starts the process of analyzing and storing new information. At its most basic level, a story is a link between cause and effect. Random data points take work to integrate and contextualize, but stories come with pre-connected dots. The significance of all of these studies is that we have come to realize that our brains do not make much of a distinction between hearing a story and experiencing those same events in real life. In 2012, Dr. Raymond Marr found a significant amount of overlap between the brain networks used to listen to stories and the networks used to navigate emotionally charged social interactions. Stories are powerful, yes, because they engage our brains, but also because they help us connect with others. We like stories because we like people. Humans were created in the image of God as relational beings, and stories highlight our unique ability to imagine scenarios that we have not experienced and to empathize with people entirely unlike us. In 2010, neuroscientist Uri Hassan began a series of groundbreaking experiments on the social aspects of how the brain responds to storytelling. Through the use of fMRI brain scans, Hassan and his team of researchers were able to quantifiably track the way that stories facilitate human communication. During the first part of the study, volunteers hooked up to fMRI machines listened to a personal story being told out loud. Although their individual brain activity was different before the story began, each participant's brain activity became synced up with the other listeners and the storyteller as the story was told. After hearing the results of Hassan's brain scan study, biomedical engineer Lucas Parra put together an international team of scientists to demonstrate that the same thing happens with the heart. When a group of people all pay attention to the same story, their heart rates tend to rise and fall in sync. Both of these studies point to the fact that stories are an incredibly persuasive means of producing empathy and rapport among strangers. So, stories can make us laugh and cry, which means that they can alter our opinions. Our perspective of the world as modern Americans is actively influenced by the stories we create, celebrate, and perpetuate. It is easy to look back on past societies and identify what facets of their culture were influenced by their storytelling. But it is much more difficult to objectively analyze the framework that we currently live within and add to every day. As such, it is very important for us as Christians, as citizens, and as scholars to deliberately engage with the media that we consume. Beginning in 2004, neuroeconomist Paul Zak conducted a series of studies on the role of the chemical oxytocin in human empathy and altruism. In one of those studies, Zak found that emotionally charged stories stimulate oxytocin production in engaged audience members, and the boosted oxytocin levels in turn lead to corresponding levels of behavior change. Get this, he found that audience members who experienced heightened levels of oxytocin and cortisol during the storytelling were 56% more likely to donate money to a related cause after the video recording ended. Even though the participants knew that the people in the video were only actors, they still felt compelled to act on behalf of a story that they had just witnessed. With all of these things in mind, it should not be surprising that we walk away from stories more than slightly changed. Although we often think of stories as entertainment to be passively consumed from the comfort of our couches, it is important to recognize that there is no such thing as a passive listener. Even if our brains logically understand that the story playing out in front of us is fictional, we are not immune to its emotional influences. God intentionally designed us in a way that prioritized storytelling as a valuable form of communication. So we have a responsibility to wield that power with integrity. So I have good news and I have bad news. The bad news is that if your goal is to influence your audience to change their fundamental behaviors, attitudes, or beliefs, then information alone will likely not be enough. As Daniel Taylor wrote in The Healing Power of Stories, a story does what facts and statistics never can. It inspires and motivates. Expert storytellers translate complex ideas into practical examples laced with strong emotional connections. The audience tunes in because they see themselves woven into the story. Thankfully, the good news is that you don't even have to be an expert storyteller to have a meaningful impact on your clients, patients, or students. You just need to tell stories that are real and good. In the words of Dr. Lainey Peterson, when a good story is being told, listeners are not only engaged, they're also involved, both in head and in heart. The research that we have explored today is just the beginning of the emerging science of narrative studies. Especially in the 21st century, stories are everywhere. We have unlimited access to more forms of storytelling now than have ever existed before. We need to pay attention to the stories we allow to shape our opinions and perspectives, and we have a responsibility to tell good, worthy stories. After all, we understand that you can learn a lot about a culture from its stories. So, what do your stories say about you? Thank you. Any questions?
Not a question, but I do have a comment. It's just so impressive to see the power of storytelling, and we can even see that in the Bible, because the way that Jesus teaches us his lessons is through the parables, and those parables really stick with you, and they really give you the meaning of what he's trying to teach.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree.
Thank you.
I was thinking along the same lines. I think it's really cool how this concept can be applied spiritually, because we all have different backgrounds, and this is going back to the research that you brought up. They were telling stories, and all of their brains got on the same wavelength. We all come from various backgrounds, and we have different opinions, but then we're all united through the Word and through Christ. So I thought that was a really cool connection.
Very cool. Thank you.
I really liked your use of connections, because as an English major, I read a lot of stories. And
that's why so many of them have survived over all these years. It's why they're popular, because they have ideas or themes or people in them that resonate.
Yeah.
And I think that a big part of connection and speaking and having a story to tell someone is also about comfort, because we find comfort in talking to one another and learning more about everyone's experiences and just the things that tie us together as human beings. And I also had a spiritual connection, so that's really fun. But you meet a lot of people today that they don't understand why we believe that the Bible is real and why it happened, and if it really did happen, and they find it difficult to connect with people from a different era. But the Bible has people in it that aren't perfect. They sin, they repent, and as Christians, we are supposed to find comfort in those connections with Christians in the Bible who were struggling to believe as well, and comfort knowing that we aren't alone. And I think that's what storytelling does go down to.
Yeah, I completely agree.
So I had a question. I just wasn't sure if this came up when you were looking into different things.
Yeah.
But you were talking about the mental effects that it has on us and like just different positives that come out of it.
Mhm.
I was wondering if there was more of an effect on younger kids. Like, are they taking in more of the imagery and that kind of thing and the descriptions? Or
Yeah.
is it the same across the board? I don't know if that came up. But
That's a good question. A lot of my research for this specifically was not on children, but just in my research, I did find a lot of articles, and I didn't read most of them, but even just like skimming the titles, we seem to understand that the stories we tell children are fundamentally, they fundamentally shape their worldview, which is something I think, as we have all alluded to so far, is something we recognize as true as Christians. But when you look at, fairy tales, even when you talk about like developing this common cultural language, if I talk about Cinderella's slipper, even though we all come from very different backgrounds all across the United States, we all, understand what that is. And so, we understand it's important, the stories that we tell to our children. And so I guess what I'm arguing for is, why should we think any less of the stories that we tell each other as adults?
I'm really fascinated by this relationship between how we value knowledge and the way we value stories. Because especially, most of us have some sort of baseline, value of knowing things and learning. And people like us are especially that way. We want to know things. I value information. I like when people tell me things I don't know. But at the same time, like you said, the reason we like stories is because they're unpredictable, because we don't know. And we're about to learn something, but we don't know what's going to happen. And the unpredictability of it is what causes that emotional attachment to the story from the listener. And you touched on that as well. It's not enough to have a logos, you have to have a pathos. There has to be an emotional attachment for you to retain that and really believe what's being told, rather than just, having facts and information thrown at you that may be very well true, but it works a lot better when that goes with some sort of tie to the emotional part of that. So that I didn't really have a question, but that was
that's a
just
good
something I'm
observation,
really fascinated by.
Very cool.
Claire, the carrying of values, we've talked about not just a good story, but stories that carry meaning. Goes back to Homer, and goes back to the Roman virtues and other things, but where did you find that in some of your research? It's not just about a good story, it's a story with a meaning, with a purpose, so it's carrying something with it. How much of that did you find?
Well, and I think this even goes back to answering Paige's question. When we talk about stories in general, I think we tend to think of things that are fictional automatically, things that are created. Once upon a time, there lived a pretty princess, happily ever after. And I think a lot of times we tend to dismiss stories because of that as inherently false. But as you're speaking to, from the beginnings of storytelling, they have been used to carry on cultural values through generations. And I believe that's still true today. And when it comes to the stories that we tell our children, I think it's C.S. Lewis and Tolkien both have essays on writing stories for children that if you don't want to read it as an adult, then you probably shouldn't tell it to your children either. And I think that's very true in terms of the values, the fundamental truth realities of stories that we tell each other.
Yeah, you mentioned the author who shall not be named, right? But you know, she's carrying along themes that she is just imitating from others in many cases. Good versus evil, what is right, how do you accomplish that? And those are eternal values. As Yuritsa said, I mean, the master teacher used parables because that's what people could relate to. So, questions from the audience? Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering how much research there is out there about the format in which the stories come. Like a person telling face-to-face versus watching a movie versus reading a book. I wonder, is there more engagement?
That's a good question.
Than the other, or-
Yeah. So throughout, there are studies that I found that I included in my paper that I didn't even cite tonight. But the studies that I've been finding and included in my research don't really make much of a distinction between stories that are told face-to-face, stories that are told through a video recording. And I think that there probably is some kind of a difference, especially when you talk about like an action thriller movie and the emotional impact that has on you versus, you know, a quiet bedtime story. But most of the things, for example, the one about the brain chemicals that happen and that cause people to donate after they watch the video, that was through a video. And then with the one with the synced up brainwaves, that was a recording of a person telling a story out loud. And so it seems that storytelling in any format has a significant impact, especially when compared to just, you know, paragraphs of straight facts. But that is interesting, a good question. I would be curious to see if a movie has a different impact than a book. But yeah, I don't know.
It's a good question because it goes to the medium, doesn't it? Words mean things, and so the types of words we use have an impact. Images carry massive meanings, and so do works of music. I mean, Beethoven moves me in a different way than looking at Monet, moves me in a different way than reading, you know, a poem or something like that. I mean, words versus images versus music, and yet they all can carry cultural meaning, and they all do.
Yeah. Well, and Mrs. Trigg, I'm sure you're familiar with the phrase that the medium is the message, which is probably what you're getting at with that question. So with that in mind, I would pretty confidently say that there is a difference, a distinction between medium or media, even if I don't have the research right in front of me.
Other questions? From the group? Yes, sir.
One of your points and takeaways was that because we recognize stories and their power, we have a responsibility to engage with them deliberately. And I think all of us are kind of familiar with that idea of consume media carefully, think critically about the stories you're consuming. But I'm curious if the more technical research into the effects on the brain give us any clues as to how we can engage deliberately to be responsible with the stories we consume.
That's a good question. Yeah. I think that is very much a personal decision. For me, that looks like not watching movies with a lot of violence. And that gets back to, that's a whole nother rabbit trail of the ancient Greeks believed that, or like the early Greeks believed that violence should not be portrayed on stage, because to sit in a chair and watch violence happen on stage and not do anything about it would be to corrupt the soul. That was anti-human, to watch violence happen to another human. And so that's why for a lot of their early plays, a lot of the violence would happen off stage. And that's, like I said, whole rabbit trail. But that is something that I think each of us has to decide for ourselves of, what am I willing to sit and watch happen with the full knowledge that this will change me? As this is a story that I'm willing to take into my heart, and in terms of foul language, violence, just things, you know, we're called to be different from the world. We're called to be transformed. And if we're watching the same movies as everyone else, then we're probably not being transformed quite as much as we should be.
Anything else from the group? Yes, ma'am.
Just one more thing, you might want to close your ears for this one.
chances. Go ahead.
I hated history because I had history teachers who taught me memorize these dates, memorize these places, and memorize these wars and move on. And then I watched a Ken Burns documentary on the Civil War, and like ever since then, you know, I kick myself for not having taken more history classes from better teachers. Because, you know, Ken Burns' Civil War documentary is, here's the diaries, here's the images, here's what was happening at home, here's what was happening away. And all of a sudden, these were real people who were having to deal with real problems and who were, and I remembered stuff. Like I could never remember those dates and places. But it just has to do with how, you know, and I watch all Ken Burns documentaries now because he just has a way of making me care about real people being affected by real things. And I love the History Channel.
Yeah. And that's even true for stories that aren't about real people in real places. If you can read a story about once upon a time and you can relate to it and you can understand these people who are so very different from you, then it kind of helps you realize, oh, well, maybe these people right across the pond aren't so different from me either. And that's how stories can build cross-cultural bridges, which is very true. But also, maybe once you finish your New Testament degree, you should start sitting in on some of Dr. Chris Bell's classes.
I hear he's a great storyteller, and they're real.
You know, Barbara Tuchman said years ago, great historian and writer, she said, if I told you that the king died and then the queen died, that's a sequence of events. You're not going to remember much more. But if I tell you that the king died and the queen died of heartache, then you have a story. Then people are going to listen. Then they're going to absorb things more. And so, yeah, it goes to some of this. How many of you have watched the original Star Wars? 1970. I don't mean Baby Yoda nonsense. I mean the original 1977 Star Wars. Were you or were you not moved when Luke is in the cockpit and he hears the voice, Luke, trust your feelings, let go of it, and he blows up the Death Star? Now that's an old movie. I was a kid when that came out. I mean, Dwayne Moyer had hair when that movie came out. And so did she. And so, I mean, those are images and stories that I told you are rooted in George Lucas, they're rooted in Joseph Campbell and mythology, and those stories carry great meaning of trust yourself over a machine, or good versus bad, those things. What else from the group? Anything else? Well, Claire, very, very good. Thank you very much for your work.
Thank you.
Okay. Caroline Branham mentioned a second-year nursing student. She's going to start her paper. I'm going to try to recover her PowerPoint since we helped Claire. We will try to help Caroline. So, Caroline, why don't you get started?
Good evening. Just to reiterate what Claire and Chloe already said, thank you so much for being here. I know it's a crazy week. I would also like to offer a disclaimer. My topic is not as lighthearted and happy as Claire's. Tonight, I'd like to consider the rising problem of the overuse of antibiotics, and specifically its effects in children. Since the introduction of penicillin in the 1940s, the use of antibiotics to treat bacterial infections has grown exponentially. It is common to visit a primary care physician and leave with a prescription and an order to take antibiotics for the next 10 to 14 days. Antibiotic treatment has become our primary response to many common ailments, such as ear infections, upper respiratory infections, sinus infections, or the common cough and cold. However, research has shown that these go-to treatments have a negative effect on the homeostasis of the symbiotic bacteria that live on and in humans, which is called the microbiota. These go-to treatments have a negative effect, and it means that the body can no longer maintain the proper production of good bacteria. Antibiotics disrupt the natural processes of the microbiota, which in turn disrupts the natural immune response to pathogens, which for our purpose tonight you can consider as bad. In comparison to adults, the use of antibiotics in infants and young children is even more disruptive, as it has disproportionate effects on the child's unstable and immature microbiota. Because children are frequently infected due to their naive immune system and vulnerability, they are often treated with antibiotics. It has become evident that these children commonly exposed to antibiotics reflect increased susceptibility to a wide spectrum of disease, including infection in later life. The overuse of antibiotics in infants and children has shown to be harmful to the gut microbiota because it disrupts its natural processes and defense against pathogens, making the child more susceptible to later infections. Understanding the function of the gut microbiome is essential to understanding the impact antibiotics truly have on the body. The microbiome is established at birth as the infant passes through the vaginal canal during delivery. The bacteria from the birth canal covers the infant, creating the microbiome. For infants that are born through cesarean section or a C-section, this is still established from skin-to-skin contact with the mother immediately following delivery or through breastfeeding. This microbiome houses viruses, archaea, bacteria, and microeukaryotes, and all of these are good bacteria that are absolutely essential to our daily functions, such as digesting food, fighting against pathogens, and maintaining immune system function. Evidence to date strongly suggests that balanced microbiota composition and rich species diversity are essential to its optimal functioning, which can be compromised in disease states. Likewise, reduced diversity and imbalanced microbiota composition in the infant's gut are associated with intestinal illnesses and a predisposition to certain diseases later in life. It is clear then that proper establishment and function of the gut microbiome is essential to maintaining a healthy life. Antibiotics are given to treat a wide variety of diseases, and there are two main types of antibiotics. The first is bactericidal. Bactericidal drugs induce cell death, completely eliminating the diseased cell from the host. Bacteriostatic drugs inhibit cell growth by inhibiting DNA and RNA synthesis, cell wall synthesis, or protein synthesis. More simply put, bacteriostatic drugs prevent further growth and reproduction of the bacterial cells. Antibiotic-mediated cell death, which is the process of antibiotics killing cells, begins with a physical interaction between a drug molecule and its bacterial-specific target and involves alterations to the affected bacterium at the biochemical, molecular, and ultrastructural levels. An antibiotic's goal, then, is to eliminate pathogens from the body. When antibiotics are overused or even administered when completely unneeded, the gut microbiome loses good bacteria and makes the body more susceptible to infections later on. We must better understand the multi-layered mechanisms by which currently available antibiotics kill bacteria, as well as explore and find alternative solutions. The repetitive use of antibiotics can also create drug-resistant bacteria. Drug-resistant bacteria are bacteria that do not react to the antibiotic, and this can create more complications and further problems than the original infection. Another problem that might arise is alterations in central metabolism and iron metabolism. When treated with high concentrations of bactericidal antibiotics, hydroxyl radicals are produced, and those are a highly reactive species of oxygen that attack organic molecules. So they're produced and they damage the natural cellular death pathway, which results in the changes to the central metabolism and iron metabolism cycles. The overuse of antibiotics not only affects the disease being targeted, but it results in less diversity of good bacteria in the host microbiome. It creates drug-resistant bacteria, and it can affect central metabolism and iron metabolism cycles. The changes within the gut microbiome as a result of frequent antibiotic use should be closely considered, as it could have destructive effects. In an article by the University of Virginia School of Medicine, or UVA, Josh Barney writes that new research shows that a reduction in the variety of microbes in the gut interferes with the immune system's ability to fight off disease. He goes on to record the findings of research conducted at UVA regarding the cause behind antibiotics' interference with the immune system. He writes, researchers at the University of Virginia School of Medicine have found that antibiotic use made neutrophils, a type of immune cell, less effective in fighting infections and weakened the intestinal barrier against invading bugs. In hopes of better understanding the role of the microbiome, stool samples were collected from children with amoebic colitis, which is a parasitic infection common to developing countries. These samples were taken from children in the urban slums of Bangladesh and concluded that the children with severe cases of amoebic colitis had less diversity in their gut microbiome. The researchers made the point that the use of antibiotics is typical in low and middle income countries and results in children being prescribed antibiotic treatment more than 24 times by the age of 2. The researchers at UVA then took their findings and used lab mice to examine how this discrepancy in natural intestinal flora, which is good bacteria, might worsen the disease. They found that antibiotics disrupted the mice's gut microbiomes, which decreased the activity of neutrophils and blocked important white blood cells from responding when needed. Essentially, the gut microbiome was left completely unguarded from invaders. Additionally, the intestinal barrier is compromised due to the disruption to the microbiome, which slows production of a cellular protein vital for the barrier to be effective. Chief over UVA's Division of Infectious Diseases, Bill Petrie, concluded from this research that the take-home from this is another important reason not to use antibiotics unless they are clearly needed. Antibiotics are extremely beneficial for treating a variety of diseases, but they must be used correctly and only when necessary to avoid further harm. I'd like to bring this back to how the overuse of antibiotics actually affects children. The adverse effects that the overuse of antibiotics has on adults is projected to be even greater in children. Because of children's developing immune systems and limited diversity within the gut microbiome, the negative effects will be amplified. The question might arise, why then do we keep prescribing antibiotics if we have this information? Children are extremely vulnerable to infections and viruses due to their naive immune system and exposure to germs from their environment, such as a daycare or school setting. Most of the infections they acquire from these environments are going to be treated with a round of antibiotics if you take them to the doctor. However, these common infections are typically viral or self-limiting, meaning it will likely resolve itself and antibiotics will not actually do anything. Yet, antibiotics continue to be prescribed. A possible reason for this lies behind the complications that come with parent-physician communication. So I'm going to digress from my point just a little bit to explore this further. Physicians have been reported to prescribe antibiotics based on the perception that parents want them. However, this assessment has not been substantiated. The complex relationship between physicians and parents often leads to unnecessary antibiotic treatment. Patient-physician communication is absolutely essential then to proper treatment of infection and disease and could prevent later complications and confusion. So evidence makes it clear that the overuse of antibiotics must be stopped, as it can result in more complicated problems with both the patient and physician. The article titled "Treating Children Without Antibiotics in Primary Healthcare" offers 2 solutions. The first is simply to not prescribe antibiotics. However, this is not always possible, and antibiotics are needed. The second option was delayed antibiotic prescription. Delayed antibiotic prescription simply means to postpone when the patient starts taking antibiotics. The purpose of this is to reduce how many antibiotics are taken overall. Oftentimes, delayed antibiotic prescription results in the patient not needing antibiotics at all because the symptoms alleviate on their own, and the infection resolves itself. Even if the antibiotics are needed, it reduces the number of drugs consumed overall. The National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence recommended delayed or no prescribing of antibiotics for 5 common diseases: acute otitis media, which is a middle ear infection, acute sore throat, acute cough and bronchitis, acute sinusitis, which is a sinus infection, and the common cold. The evidence supporting the guidelines suggests that delayed prescribing can reduce antibiotic use for the above conditions by up to 80%. The conclusive evidence argues then that following the delayed antibiotic prescription option when treating a child with a typical infection is highly recommended. However, the natural course of the illness and advice pertaining to the course of action if symptoms persist must be clearly communicated. Once again, this goes back to the importance of communication between the patient and physician. Clearly communicating what to expect when recovering from an infection without the use of antibiotics is essential. The patient must understand when to seek further help, such as if their symptoms persist or worsen. And this should be the role of the provider to make clear to the patient. With delayed prescription of antibiotics, there are different waiting periods for different diseases. For acute otitis, the patient should wait 2 to 3 days before beginning antibiotics. For a sore throat, the patient should wait 3 to 5 days before taking antibiotics. And for an acute cough, a patient should wait 10 to 14 days to start antibiotics. These waiting periods might differ for each individual based on their health history and presentation of symptoms. For example, children less than 2 years of age with bilateral otitis media, which is a middle ear infection in both ears, or otorrhea with otitis media, which is ear pain accompanied with a middle ear infection, might need immediate antibiotic prescription. These two options, not prescribing antibiotics or delaying antibiotic use, are not universal solutions. However, they do offer promising alternatives for many individuals. In the article regarding treating children without antibiotics in primary healthcare, the author wrote that for the most part, it was interesting to note in most trials on delayed prescribing that only a few patients actually resorted to antibiotic therapy, meaning even when given the option to use antibiotics, most patients were able to recover without the use of antibiotics at all. In accordance with proper communication and a clear diagnosis, resisting the immediate use of antibiotics for every common infection can prevent unnecessary antibiotic therapy. Now, I'm not trying to prevent you from taking antibiotics the next time you go to the doctor, and that's what they suggest. The fact is they can be life-saving solutions to many infections, and they should be considered one of the greatest advances in medicine to date. However, like any type of medicine, the overuse of antibiotics can have destructive results. When necessary, antibiotics should be taken when prescribed by a doctor within the time frame they prescribe them for and for the duration of time they tell you. Stopping antibiotics prematurely, even with the intent to avoid overconsumption, can result in some of the infectious bacteria surviving and multiplying, which just leads to reinfection or secondary infections, which leads to more antibiotics and defeats the purpose. Individuals should never use someone else's prescription or even one of their own previous prescriptions. General guidelines regarding any prescription medication should be considered. Antibiotics treat a variety of infections, so taking one that has not been directly prescribed to you or even one from the past would not rid you of the infectious bacteria that you have now. It would only cause unnecessary exposure to antibiotics and lead to negative side effects. Prescription antibiotics should always have a specific dosage also, so as to prevent damaging good microbes rather than just the harmful ones. The use of probiotics and prebiotics can also prevent damage to the gut microbiome, as both supplements help maintain or restore the natural microbiome and boost immune response. Sometimes antibiotics are necessary, and if that's the case, they should be used. However, there are often other options or solutions to at least try before resorting to antibiotics. Overall, it is just absolutely essential that patients and physicians practice clear communication to ensure proper treatment and to avoid the consequences that can arise from the overuse of antibiotics.
All right, this might seem like a very basic question, but several times throughout your paper you reference the overuse of antibiotics. And my first question when reading that was, how much is too much? At what point in a child's, I guess just how soon do they reach kind of this over treatment with antibiotics?
That's a hard line to define. With the children from Bangladesh with amoebic colitis, I think over 24 times within 2 years is definitely too much. But I think it also depends on the person and their immune system. The problems start to arise when you're not reacting to the antibiotic and when it's not killing off the bacteria. So I think it really depends on the person, and you can't set one line.
When I did my presentation, my topic was on interprofessional communication. And what that is, at least a part of it, is how the professional communicates with the patient or the patient's family. And reading your paper and hearing you talk, you're talking about how the parent plays a role for the child being its advocate. And I think it's also like the physician or whoever the medical professional is should maybe, if it's needed, prescribe the prescription for the antibiotics, but also give the parents the information, like the solution you were talking about. I wouldn't suggest, or studies wouldn't suggest giving your child this until maybe to see if he can fight on his own so he doesn't have that dependency on medication, because we see that a lot in our society. Like, if somebody's in pain, oh, let me take something for it. And I just think it's maybe kind of sad that we're depending so much on this.
Yeah, absolutely. And it does go back to that communication. And I think that's a good idea, that as long as parents understand if they need to bring their child back in or if they should go ahead and start the antibiotics. And part of that is just making sure that you have a good relationship with your care provider, and the care provider should, offer, call me if you have any questions, or check in with our office and we can see him again. So yeah, it goes back to communication for sure.
For those of you that don't know, I'm a business major, and one of the things that often goes with being a business major is you get really cynical about a lot of things. And I try to avoid that as much as possible. But in this case, the place my mind immediately went was the way that, and this is always a question that when you're talking about the medical profession, this always comes up, is the question of, like, who and how much are people profiting off of something like this? And so I was curious if you saw anything or learned anything about the way that pharmacies and like the people who develop and produce the drugs, like if those people, I want to be careful how I phrase this, because I'm not suggesting like there's a vast conspiracy happening, but I'm curious to know how much that has played into this whole situation, because those people, the more antibiotics that are used, the better it is for those companies and those businesses.
I did not look into that at all. But I think probably most of it is we're just used to doing it. We're used to using antibiotics. It's what we know works until it doesn't. And so, yeah, I'm not sure the business side of it. I haven't heard anything about that, so sorry.
You used a stat about delaying, like this prescription can reduce antibiotic use by 80% or up to 80%. I was just kind of wondering, is that like because none is needed in some of these cases, or is it just less per person? I wasn't sure if you just knew that, because I was curious if it went away on its own.
From my understanding, it was that 80% ended up not needing the antibiotics at all. That could be wrong, but that's how I interpreted it.
You said the two options, but obviously you said there were more about, but one of them being not prescribing antibiotics or delaying antibiotic use. And I was just wondering if, in your research, if you found anything about natural remedies being favorable or faster results, or if they were safer for children than giving them antibiotics.
I didn't see anything about like any natural interventions. I only really looked into those two options, but I think it could go with just not prescribing antibiotics, because like I said, especially with children, we often prescribe antibiotics for viruses and it doesn't actually do anything for them. So just letting it run its course would be a natural option, but I don't know if that would, I don't know if there's anything you can do to speed up the process.
Y'all haven't had kids yet. And if you have, you need to talk to me later, I suppose, but when you have a child, and that child's sick, it goes to the communication that Yuritsa mentioned. What do you want? Relief for the pain. And I think that's what's probably driven a lot of this. My mind went to what Seth said, who's benefiting are their pharmaceutical interests, but I think it's more that I want my child out of pain. And it doesn't matter how old they are. You want them comfortable, you don't want them in pain. To let it run its course for 14 days to cough, that may work. Drive me up a wall if I'm a parent. All I want to do is fix the problem. So, what questions do we have from the audience? Do y'all want to have a cough for 14 days? Yes, ma'am.
I was just curious if, because, and you mentioned this, but if there is overuse or overtreatment with antibiotics, and like the children you were talking about that had, when they did studies, they had fewer healthy flora, their microbiome was lower, are they more susceptible to secondary infections? Like, is that more common with these children who have a less healthy gut biome?
Definitely, yeah. Reduction in diversity means that you can't fight off as much overall, so it definitely would make them more susceptible.
Yes, Mrs. Moore?
Did you find anything that might indicate a possible connection between overuse of antibiotics and a lactose intolerance that's rising in society?
I did not see anything about that. That's interesting. I hadn't even considered that.
You talked about how an overuse of antibiotics weakens the microbiome or can damage it. From that, do you think that, like, conducting tests that look into a child's gut flora would, like, help, or, like, looking at their diet and stuff and suggesting stuff that grows that gut flora and strengthens it would help prevent, like, that overuse from damaging it as much? Or
I think it could, and that could go into what you were saying as like a natural remedy, or I also mentioned prebiotics and probiotics, and they are kind of supposed to do the same thing, but that might be like a more natural option. So I definitely think that could work, yeah.
What other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I'm kind of on the same wavelength that Dr. Crisbell is about waiting so many days when your child has a sore throat or an ear infection or a cough. Are there any, so you wait these so many days before you start an antibiotic, are there instances when that is an adverse, it's too late, and then we're into something really where the ear is damaged or what have you?
I think it's a possibility, which again goes back to the communication. I think if, I'm not a physician, obviously, but I think if I wasn't confident in my diagnosis as a physician, I would go ahead and prescribe those antibiotics. Or if I had concerns about it developing into something worse, I would communicate that with the patient and the parents, and then check up on that, maybe have them come in a couple days later to reevaluate it, rather than just tell them in 10 days you can start these if you need it. But monitor it yourself, maybe.
Was your hand up? Okay. This goes to, no other questions? Good. Goes to the matter of trust, doesn't it, in your physician? Yes, ma'am.
I don't have a question. I was just going to, I've had a number of students who've written research papers on this topic in the past 10 years. And to answer Karen's question, very rarely, as a matter of fact, I don't know of any reported instances where the wait and see approach was detrimental to the child's overall health. But again, it goes back to communication, making sure that the parents understand what symptoms do we, at what point would the medication be used. I'm a big fan of that approach, actually.
Do we discount how strong our bodies are to fight off infections now that we have the, I don't want to say the crutch, but the advantage of medications? And so we tend to over-medicate. And that's probably, it's a cultural thing, I suppose, with us and with industrialized societies. We're used to using these things, and so we use them. So, how many of y'all had ear infections as kids? Yeah, did you have to change to a different prescription drug? Yeah. I mean, oftentimes you try one, doesn't work where you've used it before, they switch you to another, whether it's amoxicillin or something else, and that's the most common thing. So it comes down to trust, communication, knowing your people, right? Not just the numbers and what you say the diagnosis is. So there's a lot to it. All right, well, it's been a good evening. We appreciate you very much, Caroline. And we we appreciate you being here tonight. Again, we have one more evening scheduled, and that's in early December, December the 6th, when Seth Kemple is going to be our lone presenter over in McCarty Auditorium. So come, bring your toughest questions for Seth. He can handle it. He will be cynical and ask the business question and response. So we appreciate you being here tonight. You had many things to do, and it's a busy time of the semester. Appreciate you being with us and appreciate your encouragement of these up here on the stage. And we're dismissed. Have a great evening.